You woke up at 3 in the morning last week with that familiar feeling of tightness in your chest, didn't you? That diffuse anxiety that seems to emerge from nowhere, but has everything to do with something you can't quite fully name. It's as if your body knows something your mind is still trying to process. Maybe it was after reading another news story about artificial intelligence replacing jobs, or after realizing you can no longer distinguish between human written text and machine generated content. Perhaps it was watching your 10-year-old daughter converse more naturally with virtual assistants than with you. Or maybe it was that moment when you realized you can no longer imagine what the world will look like in 5 years, and this uncertainty paralyzes you in a way you've never experienced before. This is not just your personal anxiety, it's the harbinger of something much larger that's approaching. In 2026, we'll be at the epicenter of an unprecedented collective psychological crisis in human history, and most people will be caught completely unprepared because they don't understand the fundamental nature of what's happening. This isn't just about technological or economic changes. We're witnessing the gradual dissolution of the psychological structure that has sustained humanity for millennia, and most of us don't even realize it's happening. To understand what awaits us, we first need to recognize that all our mental stability as a species has always depended on 3 fundamental pillars that are now being simultaneously destroyed for the first time in history. The first pillar is predictability of the future. For tens of thousands of years, a young hunter-gatherer could look at his father and grandfather and have a reasonably accurate idea of what his own life would be like. Even during the Industrial Revolution, changes were slow enough for a person to adapt gradually. You could plan a career, a family, an entire life based on patterns that remained relatively stable for decades. The second pillar is the sense of personal agency, the belief that our individual choices and efforts have significant impact on our destinies. This belief has been fundamental to human psychology since we developed consciousness of ourselves as individuals. Even in authoritarian societies or rigid caste systems, people maintained some sense of control over aspects of their lives, some area where they could exercise choice and see results. The third pillar is narrative coherence, our ability to create stories that give meaning to our experience and connect us to something larger than ourselves. For most of human history, these narratives were provided by religion, tradition, community. Even when traditional religious narratives began to weaken, they were replaced by other equally powerful ones: scientific progress, national development, class struggle, the American dream. There was always a larger story into which we could insert our individual lives and find meaning. Today, for the first time in human history, these 3 pillars are being simultaneously destroyed by forces that move much faster than our capacity for psychological adaptation. The exponential speed of technological changes has made the future completely unpredictable. We can no longer look ahead even 5 years and have any confidence about what the job market will be like, what skills will be relevant, or even what kind of society we'll be inhabiting. A programmer today cannot be certain that their profession will exist in 2030. A doctor doesn't know if artificial intelligence will make their expertise obsolete or transform it in unforeseen ways. Parents cannot prepare their children for a world they cannot imagine. Simultaneously, our sense of personal agency is being eroded by algorithmic systems that make decisions about our lives in ways we don't understand and can't influence. Your consumption habits, your political preferences, even your romantic choices are being shaped by algorithms that know you better than you know yourself. What you see on your social networks, what jobs are offered to you, what products appear when you search, all of this is determined by systems that operate beyond your understanding or control. You have the illusion of choice while navigating through options that have been pre-selected for you by machines that have analyzed billions of data points about your behavior, and perhaps most devastatingly, the traditional narratives that gave meaning to human life are disintegrating without equally powerful narratives replacing them. The institutions that traditionally provided meaning, from organized religions to nation states, even science as a source of objective truth, are losing authority in a world where anyone can find an online community that confirms any belief system, where the distinction between fact and opinion has become blurred, where the very notion of shared reality is under attack. The result is that millions of people are experiencing what psychologists call existential disintegration, without even having vocabulary to describe what they're feeling. This is why we see dramatic increases in anxiety, depression, addictions, compulsive behaviors, conspiracy theories, and political extremism. These aren't separate symptoms, but different manifestations of the same underlying crisis, the dissolution of the psychological structure that gave stability to human experience. But here's what most people don't realize. 2026 won't just be a gradual continuation of these trends. It will be an inflection point where multiple forces converge to create an acute, time-concentrated psychological crisis. First, it's when many of the promises and threats of artificial intelligence will begin to materialize in concrete and undeniable ways. They won't be laboratory demonstrations or limited experiments anymore, but massive and visible transformations of the world, of work, education, creativity, decision-making at all levels of society. Second, it's when the generation that grew up entirely in the digital era will reach full adulthood, but discover that the skills and expectations they were raised with don't align with the reality they're inheriting. Third, it's when the economic and social effects of decisions made during and after the pandemic will crystallize into a new reality that many won't be prepared to accept. Most people are preparing for the future as if it were a more intense version of the present, but this is precisely the mental trap that will lead to psychological collapse. They're trying to strengthen old mental structures instead of developing new ones. They're seeking more control when they need to learn to navigate uncertainty. They're looking for more convincing narratives when they need to learn to live without the need for a definitive story that explains everything. The fundamental difference between those who will successfully navigate the crisis of 2026 and those who will be destroyed by it will be the capacity to embrace what we might call existential flexibility. This doesn't just mean being adaptable or resilient in the traditional sense. It means developing a completely new form of mental structure that can function without the three traditional pillars I mentioned. Instead of predictability, we need to learn to find stability in impermanence itself, to develop a sense of continuity that doesn't depend on knowing what comes next. This requires a fundamental shift in how we conceive of time and planning. Instead of trying to predict and control the future, we need to become experts at perceiving and responding to the constantly changing present. It's the difference between being an engineer who builds rigid structures and being a surfer who moves with the wave. Instead of agency in the sense of direct control over outcomes, we need to develop what we might call responsive agency, the ability to influence indirectly through the quality of our attention, our choices about where we focus our energy, our capacity to recognize and work with patterns rather than trying to force specific outcomes. It's like learning to dance with a partner instead of trying to lead alone all the time. And instead of fixed narratives that explain everything, we need to learn to live comfortably with multiple simultaneous narratives, some of which may even contradict each other. This doesn't mean relativism or cynicism, but rather a more sophisticated form of relationship with truth that recognizes that different frameworks can be useful in different contexts without any of them needing to be absolutely correct. This transformation is not optional. Those who cling to old mental structures will be like people trying to use roadmaps to navigate oceans. No matter how accurate those maps are for their original purpose, they're simply not suitable for the territory we're entering. The tragedy is that much of the suffering that's coming is unnecessary, not because the changes can be avoided, but because it's possible to develop the mental capacities that will allow not just surviving these changes, but thriving through them. But this requires recognizing that we are in a historical transition comparable to agriculture or industrialization, not just going through another phase of technological change. The societies that understand this first and begin to intentionally develop these new psychological capacities will have an enormous advantage. Those that continue operating with obsolete psychological assumptions will experience levels of social dysfunction that will make our current problems seem trivial. Let me pause for a moment to ask, do you feel this growing tension between the speed at which the world is changing and your capacity to psychologically process these changes? Those moments when you realize you can no longer distinguish between what's real and what's artificial, between what's temporary and what's permanent. I know many of us keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming like we can't keep up, or for not having adequate words to express something so fundamental. But your experience is valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. I feel this disconnection from the future most intensely when your honesty can help others realize they're not alone in this profound transition we're all experiencing. Historically, there has always been a difference between change and transformation. Change is when things become different but maintain their essential nature. Transformation is when something becomes fundamentally another kind of thing. A caterpillar that grows is changing. A caterpillar that becomes a butterfly is transforming. The crucial difference is that during transformation, there's always a period of dissolution where the old form must be completely dismantled before the new can emerge. Humanity is entering its cocoon phase. The problem is that, unlike caterpillars, we maintain our consciousness during the process. We know something is dissolving, but we can't yet see what's emerging. This consciousness of dissolution without vision of the new form is precisely what will cause the psychological collapse of 2026 for those who aren't prepared. But there's something even deeper happening here that most analyses of the future fail to capture. We're not just witnessing changes in technology or society. We're witnessing a change in the very nature of human cognition. For thousands of years, our individual intelligence has been complemented and amplified by external tools, from writing to the internet. But we always maintained a clear distinction between what happened inside our heads and what happened out there in the world. This distinction is dissolving. When you can no longer distinguish between human-written and machine-generated text, when your decisions are shaped by algorithms that have analyzed more data about you than you could process in several lifetimes, when your memory is outsourced to devices that can access all human information instantly, where exactly does your mind end and artificial mind begin? This isn't an abstract philosophical question. It has profound practical psychological consequences. Our identity as individuals has always depended on having a relatively clear boundary between ourselves and the external world. When this boundary becomes porous and ambiguous, we experience what psychologists call ego dissolution, but on an unprecedented collective scale. Most people will try to resist this dissolution, try to strengthen and defend the old boundaries of their individual identity. This resistance will create an unsustainable psychological tension that will manifest as extreme anxiety, compulsive behaviors, desperate seeking for control, and eventually collapse. It's like trying to hold water in closed fists. The more force you apply, the faster it escapes. But there's an alternative. Instead of resisting the dissolution of old boundaries, we can learn to navigate in a more fluid and distributed type of identity. This doesn't mean losing our individuality, but rather expanding our notion of what constitutes the self to include our integration with broader systems of intelligence and meaning. Think about how an experienced musician relates to their instrument. There's a clear distinction between the musician and the guitar, but during performance, they function as an integrated system. The musician doesn't lose their identity by temporarily merging with the instrument. In fact, this fusion allows for deeper expression of their individuality. Similarly, learning to function as part of human-AI hybrid systems can expand our capacity for expression and creation, not diminish it. But this requires developing what we might call porous identity, the ability to maintain a continuous sense of self, even when the boundaries between our cognition and artificial cognition become fluid. It's like learning to be a drop in the ocean that maintains its coherence even while being part of something much larger. This transformation of human consciousness is not something that will simply happen to us. It's something we can consciously participate in and shape, but only if we recognize that it's happening and intentionally develop the capacities necessary to navigate it, the implications go far beyond personal adaptation. We are talking about the birth of a new kind of civilization that operates with different assumptions about the nature of intelligence, identity, reality. The societies that understand this first and manage to facilitate this transition healthily will lead the next chapter of human history. Those that cling to old models will experience decades of instability and suffering. What makes all this even more urgent is that these changes are happening much faster than any previous historical transformation. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture took thousands of years. The Industrial Revolution took centuries. This transformation is happening in decades. Our psychological, social, and political systems simply weren't designed to process changes at this speed. This is why 2026 will be a year of acute crisis. It's when the speed of external changes will completely exceed the adaptive capacity of traditional human systems. It will be like trying to run 2026 software on 1990 seconds hardware. The system will simply crash. But crises also create opportunities. When old systems become clearly inadequate, there's an opening for genuinely new systems to emerge. The psychological collapse of 2026 will also be the birth moment of a new form of human consciousness more suited to the reality we're creating. The question isn't whether this transformation will happen, it's whether we'll participate consciously in it or be dragged along by it. Whether we'll intentionally develop the capacities that will allow us to thrive in the new world, or be passive victims of changes we don't understand. For those who choose conscious participation, the approaching period won't be a crisis, but the most extraordinary adventure in human history. It will be the chance to participate in creating entirely new forms of intelligence, meaning, and experience. It will be like being part of the first generation to learn to fly, or the first generation to leave Earth. But this requires courage to release the old mental structures that gave us security in the past and confidence to navigate completely new territory without maps. It requires what ancient philosophers called wisdom, not just knowledge about the world, but the capacity to live with elegance in the face of fundamental uncertainty. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you're not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser ways to live amid the transformations we're witnessing. This isn't just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth, where we prepare our minds to consciously navigate the deepest transformation our species has ever experienced. Join us on this continuing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to not just survive, but thrive through the metamorphosis that's transforming what it means to be human in the 21st century.